As Ellen said, I'm the Wilderness Monitoring Coordinator for the park, and I'm here to talk about wilderness at Grand Canyon and an update to the Backcountry plan. I'm going to do it in reverse order, just because I don't have much to say about the Backcountry plan update. In 2010 or late 2010, early 2011, we started on an update to the 1988 Backcountry Management Plan. Determines how we manage visitation in the backcountry and how we do with that. In 2015, December of 2015, we released the draft plan and the draft EIS that goes along with it. Held a couple of public meetings, public webinar, took comments for the following 4 months, and then analyzed those through August of 2016. And at that point, things came to a halt for a couple of reasons. We have not made much more progress since then, primarily because two other issues arose that required a lot of the park's attention. It includes the bison that Greg talked about. That's a problem that has to be solved fairly quickly, and the other is the Trans-Canyon water pipeline that allows all of us to live over here. Those have sucked all the oxygen out of the room, all the planning capacity we have right now. We do have I've been talking to Rachel Bennett, who's the planning and compliance lead on the plan. She's got a strategy she's working on to move forward, but this, we really can't do much right now given our capacity. If you want to talk to Rachel about this, she said she's happy to talk with anybody about what's going on. She will put you on a mailing list for updates. So that's how you contact Rachel. I can give you this email address afterwards. I want to talk about wilderness. It's much more fun to discuss. So what percent of Grand Canyon is managed as wilderness? You guys, is this something you guys are familiar with? Got a guess? 90%. Actually, it's, if you include both potential and other wilderness, it's 94%. It's most of the park is managed as wilderness. Greg said the North Rim is designated wilderness. This is the formal definition of wilderness. What percent of Grand Canyon is designated wilderness? You guys know? That's correct. It's absolutely none. Since coming into this position, I've discovered that wilderness is a huge process. It requires that there be wilderness study. Recommendation comes from the park in terms of what areas are eligible, what areas fit the criteria for wilderness designation. That proposal goes to the director for a signature. From there it goes to the president and the Secretary of Interior, and from there to Congress, and that just has not happened for Grand Canyon. But in the meantime, we manage any area that's been found to be eligible for wilderness designation as wilderness, with the idea that you don't lose wilderness character until, during the time up until Congress actually makes a decision or is presented with a decision to be made. So we don't want to mess things up while we're waiting for wilderness designation. In the meantime, this is a map showing the different varieties of wilderness in the park. This greenish color is the proposed wilderness. It's most of the park. It is eligible. There are no non-conforming uses in those areas. Everything is in place for that. This potential wilderness has non-conforming uses or other issues related to it. That includes the entire river corridor. I messed up the map here. This is supposed to extend the rest of the way out, but there is motorized use on the river, and that is a non-conforming use in wilderness. So until that's taken care of, we can only make this potential wilderness. There's the non-wilderness backcountry that's the corridor between the North Rim and the South Rim. That's non-wilderness primarily because of the infrastructure that's there. All the water, all the rangers, all the toilets down at Phantom Ranch, those are non-conforming uses, and this is also non-wilderness front country. Around the primitive roads, or the paved roads as well, on the North Rim at Tuweep and Kanab Point area, there are 150-foot wide non-wilderness buffers around those roads because they're still in use, and we cannot have roads in wilderness. But this potential wilderness area over here is referred to as the Navajo inholding. You're probably aware there's boundary disputes or an uncertain boundary with the Navajo Nation on the east side, and so this is considered potential wilderness. It's considered a variety of inholding. The other thing I wanted to point out is that in addition to wilderness in Grand Canyon, there is a lot of designated and proposed wilderness around. This is the proposed areas that are part of Grand Canyon Parashant National Monument. These other areas are designated wilderness managed by BLM and the Forest Service around here, and combined it creates quite an extensive wilderness area. I just want to go through a little history about why we are where we are. The 1964 was when the Wilderness Act was passed by Congress. It passed in the Senate 99-1. The one dissenting vote believed that it didn't go far enough to protect wilderness, and it required that within 10 years there be all federal land managers survey for eligible wilderness. Let's go back. The preliminary wilderness study came out in 1970. The first the wilderness recommendation and statement, environmental impact statement for that was in 1973. It was held in abeyance, and when the Grand Canyon Enlargement Act that added parts to the west, it added Marble Canyon, it added BLM land around as well. They had to go back to the drawing board. Within a year or two, they came up with a new wilderness recommendation. This one was actually signed by the director of the Park Service, and it recommended all of the areas that I showed you in green before, and that we wait until motorized use on the river was eliminated before we declared the river corridor to be wilderness. But there was the Colorado River Management Plan was coming out. Interior Department wanted to wait until they settled motorized use on the river, figure out what happened there. Once that 1980 River Management Plan came out, there was a final revised wilderness recommendation that was essentially the 1977, but at that point, nothing has happened. Nothing has happened since then. There's been two updates in 1993 and 2010. Park personnel went back and reviewed criteria for wilderness designation, and used in the 2010 they applied GIS technology, computerized mapping that was a lot more accurate. But until things get forwarded to the Interior Department and Congress, nothing is going to happen as far as wilderness designation goes. So I want to talk about wilderness and what makes a wilderness. There are a lot of ways of defining it. It's a social construct. It's the way we think about things. The definition is in the Wilderness Act of 1964. The legal definition, if you're curious and need some reading, come talk to me. I'll give you one of these. In the very back of it, it's got the entire text of the Wilderness Act. But basically, this is almost flowery language that Congress put in. It was written by Howard Zahniser, who was the secretary of the Wilderness Society. But this is why we have wilderness. Expanding populations, expanding settlement and mechanization. These are things we need to prevent from taking over every place. There are 4 agencies that manage wilderness. Park Service, Forest Service, BLM, and the Fish and Wildlife Service actually has some wilderness areas. The way we look at wilderness is that it is untrammeled. It's a very important word. It means uncontrolled. Trammeling is the control of natural processes. It's not walking on it and trampling it. Undeveloped, there are no permanent developments within wilderness, no permanent roads. It is natural. There are substantially native populations, self-sustaining, and outstanding opportunities for solitude or a primitive and unconfined recreation type. And the 5th quality is other features of value, and this generally has to do with scenic or scientific or historic features that are important in telling the wilderness story. Okay, this is a slightly different map. This is the way we manage wilderness areas in the backcountry. This is, there are 4 zones of backcountry areas. The corridor is the non-wilderness backcountry zone that I talked about before. Threshold areas generally have a lot of visitation. These are places with either roads or water sources nearby. You know, here's the whole Hermit Monument area. It gets a ton of use. This is the Clear Creek. It gets a lot of use. These are places where you're going to find toilets and so on. Primitive is the next most developed, and finally the wild are areas without no maintained trails, very little in the way of signage or wayfinding assistance. So where are we going from here? We have, as I said, we're working on the backcountry plan, but we're also working on a wilderness stewardship plan. We have a wilderness intern, a wilderness stewardship intern who's being paid by the National Wilderness Stewardship Division. Toby Nickel is here for the next couple of months. He's working on both the wilderness narrative and the baseline assessment. These are 2 necessary parts before you can create your wilderness stewardship plan. We're hoping to have a wilderness stewardship plan out in 2019. We hope that we get the backcountry plan done beforehand, but this is something we need to work on. And as far as you all, your part in this, we cannot do this without the help of you as partners. Things that you can do to help, things you can do to maintain wilderness qualities would be to apply and teach leave no trace practices to your clients and advocate for Grand Canyon wilderness. This is, it's laid dormant since 1977, basically. And the only way it's going to move is if congressmen and senators hear from their constituents that there needs to be some action, some permanent protection for Grand Canyon's wilderness. And that's all I got about wilderness. I'd be happy to answer questions if you have them. It has to do a lot with motorized use on the river. It's a very strong and very active constituency. The reason that in 1980 there was that final recommendation, it didn't move forward because there were items in the wilderness plan that would have motorized use phased out on the river. There was an amendment to the Hatch Amendment to the Interior Appropriations Bill that said you will not remove motorized use from the river. And there were a few other times, I think in '93 we started to move forward again. The administration seemed to be favorable towards Grand Canyon. Bruce Babbitt was in the secretary's position. But again, there was a concerted effort by motorized users that caused the senators to withdraw that plan. So, yeah. The question was, would wilderness designation have any effect on the air tours? That I don't know. I don't think so. The prohibitions against aircraft in wilderness are landings and takeoffs. Those are the two things you can't do. That's why you can't have drones in the backcountry. But we are working in a separate project on soundscapes. We're trying to revive that whole group within our division to maybe come back at the air tours. But no, I don't think it would have an impact. It would be something that would have to be considered. Their impacts have to be considered when you're looking at wilderness designation, but no, you can't legislate from there. It's a separate set of regulations. Yeah. Yeah, there were two items that were the most controversial and that would require the most amount of work. You can probably guess one of them was the commercial services section. The plan, as released, called for shifting from unlimited CUA authorizations to a limited number of commercial concessions contracts. And that, from this group, there was a lot of pushback here. And the park is not really ready to start thinking about what to do about that. The other was extended day hiking and trail running. And again, it was a fairly controversial part of the plan, and there was a lot of pushback from that community, and so the park needs to spend some time figuring out what to do about those two things. I mean, it may be that those get set aside for now and we get to move forward with the pack rafting and canyoneering issues and, you know, some of the other stuff, use area management, do that separately and then come back with an EIS on those two. But, you know, Rachel she's ever hopeful. She thinks that maybe by the end of this year we'll have something going, but, you know, it really does take, I mean, it's going to take all the divisions of the park working on it, and we just don't have that capacity. So, yeah. I don't think it hurts to write your congressman. I think, you know, until there's a constituency built up, a level of pressure that's equal to the pressures pushing in the other direction, I don't think there'll be movement, but yeah, I would continue to write your congressman, write your senator. It would be part of the resolution of this would be the motorized use on the river would have to be addressed in a wilderness plan. Yeah, because when they tried, I think in the early 90s, they tried to move ahead without addressing that. And they said, okay, we'll set this, we'll leave motorized use on the river and we'll just consider the rest of the backcountry. And the motorized, or the river concessioners said, oh, don't do that because once you get the rest of it designated, there'll be a lot more pressure on designating the river. And, you know, so yeah, you're right. We need to solve that. Okay, we good?